as a church leader, like, I just think about, okay, if we're preparing the jars for God to work, and let's say retroactively we are able to see the story of our church and the story of what God would do, and what if it was like, okay, you're going to see as many people get baptized in terms of the way that you plan for Easter, or you're going to see as many people get baptized in terms of how many inviter cards that you're going to buy and hand out to your church. If we knew, like, okay, that's going to lead to that, then that phrase, not too few, we would take that very, very, very seriously.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right, welcome back to the Breaking Barriers podcast. I'm going to start today's podcast by using Bobby's now world-famous intro to our very first episode. I'm going to say the words, hello, internet. So we're glad to have you guys back. Hey, we're going to dive into some cool stuff today. Pastor Bobby has done a teaching that originated maybe a year and a half ago, some things that we talk about a lot around Mercy Hill in a phrase that we use called prepare the jars. I think the first time I ever heard anybody say that was Sean Lovejoy, a coach of mine, talking about how we can prepare well for what God is going to do. So we're going to get into that. Really looking forward to 2 Kings 4. Before we dive into that, just a quick recap of some of where we've been. This podcast is based around how going churches are growing churches. You can grow without going, but you cannot go consistently, repeatedly without growing. There is something that God does in the harvest that is important for us to be able to sustain long-term sending, whether you're talking about church planting or missionaries. This seems obvious enough, right? But it feels like we live in a culture that wants to focus solely on sending or disciple making or maturity for the believer without first talking about the pool, the top of the funnel, which is kind of church growth and all the things that go in with that. And so what we're trying to do in this podcast is keep those things together, not separate them. We're not going to do the great divorce that's happening now. We want to make disciples, but we don't care about growing churches. We just fully reject that. A better way to say it would be you grow churches in order to make disciples. And so that's what we're getting into today. Bobby, we're going to talk about 2 Kings, chapter 4, prepare the jars. So what are we going to get into today?
Yeah, so, Breaking Barriers is all about helping church leaders and helping churches break through these barriers of growth so that they can ultimately go. And the different barriers are many. Sometimes it's just a knowledge gap. Sometimes it's the barrier of our own limited thinking, our own faith, our own courage. In the first two episodes, we kind of talked about the barrier of, this kind of anti-growth mindset that we can buy into where, we maybe feel guilty about trying to grow. And so today specifically, I really want to talk about kind of the barriers that we put on ourselves as leaders. And, the times when, we may hide behind some, spiritual reason or something like that. But sometimes the thing that's holding us back is our own fear about what it's going to look like to grow, what it's going to look like to have the vision to lead a church to the next place. And so we're going to be in 2 Kings 4. That's where we're going to talk about the concept, but we're just going to really kind of discuss what this looks like in leadership. And here's a good way, I think, to set it up. Because as Christians, we understand that when we come to Christ through the gospel, we don't have God prove himself to us and then have faith. We have faith as a starting point, to experience God move in our life. Like, faith is the starting point. It's not, God, you got to do all these things. You got to prove all these things to me. It's like, no. We have to sit down in the chair and say, God, I believe, I have faith, and then God will begin to move in our lives. That, I think, for a believer is easy to understand. That's how I came to God on God's terms. Faith is the starting point. Here's the thing that happens, though, I think, and there's probably lots of different reasons for this. For some reason in our personal leadership in the church and our personal leadership in life, what ends up happening is we kind of flip that, and we want God to move in a big way in some specific area of our life, some specific area of our church, some specific area of leadership. We want God to move in a big way before we actually step out in faith. And we just have a lot of kind of frameworks, models in the Bible that say, man, as a leader, over any amount of people, that we've got to be willing to step out in faith to actually see God move. And so that's what I want to talk about, this framework of how do we actually think about this. So one way to think about it, here's the actual kind of formula. One way to think about it would be, okay, God moves, I take massive action, and then on the back end, I believe, I have faith because I've seen what God's done. The framework that I think is probably more biblical in most cases would be, we have to believe first, we then take massive action without seeing God work, and then on the very back end, God moves, we see God work. That's how leadership happens most of the time. There's so many examples in Jesus's ministry of this. We're going to talk specifically about 2 Kings 4. But before I dive in, what just kind of general thoughts do you have? Because both of us, we've it's not like we've always succeeded in this, like we've failed in this a lot of times, and there's tons of times we've been fearful and scared. But planting a church like we have and seeing it go from nothing to grow, you've just experienced just like the truth of this concept. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot. Like we don't get to control what God does, right? That would make us God. He does. He's going to do what he's going to do. We do get to control what we're going after and what we're believing him for. And I think when you frame what you're saying, when you think about it in light of the whole conversation, it's a little bit like, what are, pastor, leader in a church, leader over a ministry. It's like, what are you really going after? Like, what are you there to do? What are you trying to do? I think one question, pastors need to ask themselves sort of semi-regularly is, okay, tomorrow morning you're going to get up, you're going to have your quiet time, you're going to take your kids to school, you're going to get in the truck and you're going to head to the office. Okay. On the way, what are you trying to do that day? I don't mean like that day. I'm just saying, what is that day going to contribute overall into what you're trying to do? And, is there a bigger vision for growth and sending? Is there something that you have in your mind, or is it a little bit like, man, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what I'm trying to do. I think some of that ties into what you're saying here, because I think sometimes we might be in a little more of a mindset of, man, I'm just going to kind of bump along, be faithful. If God moves, then we'll believe that he was going to do something great because he did it. It's like, well, the problem with that is it's not actually faith. Right. Faith is on the front end. Right. What I hope we can do through this podcast, and maybe even today, is get more to the place. I think this is where we were. I don't know that we were totally expecting God to do exactly what he did here, maybe, but we certainly were asking him to. It's certainly what we wanted to see happen. So we were having that, what you're saying, we were having kind of that belief moment on the front end, evidenced by our prayer life. What were we asking God to do? What were we going after? What were the big goals that we were setting? Right. And that was happening on the front end, not after we'd already seen God move.
Yeah, here's another way to say it, because we're going to flesh this out, but it's not necessarily like 100% of the time, because I think, one way to say it is, we want our faith to be reactive after God moves, and most of the time God wants our faith to be proactive. Now, there are examples of like the beginning of Acts where, God tells the disciples, hey, you're going to go and wait, right? You're going to go and wait until God moves. And so, yes, there's evidence for that in the Bible, obviously. But the problem is people take that and they say, okay, that's 100% of leadership in the church, when in fact, there's tons of times where God wants us to express our faith in him by being to walk out on the water before we see God move.
Right.
And 2 Kings 4 is an
Yeah,
example.
yeah, and I think if anybody is still trying to like, okay, exactly what are they? To me, where this most practically sets up is like what your goals are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because a lot of times your prayer goals and the goals you have for your church, those things are faith statements on the front end. They're at least what you're asking God for, what you're believing Him for.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the reactive side would be more like, well, I'm not. You know, goals are carnal, they're corporate. We don't do goals. We don't pray for God to do big things. We just kind of wait and see what He's going to do. And that feels like the opposite sort of Paul, who makes it his ambition to get to places where the gospel has not been named.
Right. So here's 2 Kings 4, and most people listening to this have probably heard this story, but it's one of the places we get this sort of framework in the Bible. So 2 Kings 4, it says, "Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband's dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord. But the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves.' And Elisha said to her, 'What shall I do for you?' So the prophet just asked her very clearly, 'What is it that you want me to do for you?' She says this, He says this, 'What shall I do for you? Tell me what you have in the house.' And she said, 'Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil.'" So here's what's happening. Her husband's died. I mean, she's in just a desperate, terrible situation. She's basically in slavery to her debt probably, and it's just like a dire situation. She needs a miracle in her life. She goes to the prophet, and he probably could just like snap his fingers, God could just work a miracle right there. But the question is, what do you have in the house? And so the indicator we get right there, and you see this interaction with Jesus and a lot of people, somebody comes and they're asking for something, and very quickly we see, okay, God is going to use the person's faith in their own miracle. So he's asking, instead of just snapping his fingers and it happening, he basically just says, "Hey, what do you have in the house?" Because she's going to have to go out and get these jars. And so what we're already seeing here is that God, or the prophet, wants to see her faith precede the work of God. Okay, so in verse 3, the prophet says this, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels," and then it says this phrase, "not too few." And what we're going to see in the rest of the story is however many vessels that she goes out and gets, that's how many vessels that are actually going to be filled. And so like retroactively looking at the story, basically this phrase, "not too few," as a church leader, like I just think about, okay, if we're preparing the jars for God to work, and let's say retroactively we are able to see the story of our church and the story of what God would do, and what if it was like, okay, you're going to see as many people get baptized in terms of the way that you plan for Easter, or you're going to see as many people get baptized in terms of how many inviter cards that you're going to buy and hand out to your church. If we knew like, okay, that's going to lead to that, then that phrase, "not too few," we would take that very, very, very seriously. So she's given this task, and you could just imagine, I think this would be pretty embarrassing, in a culture where everybody knows one another. She's in a dire situation. She's poor, going to people's house saying, "Hey, do you have any empty jars for me?" I mean, you could just imagine all of the insecurity in her to go out and to be doing this. And so she goes out, she gets the jars. The verse 4 says this, "Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all the vessels. And when one is full, set it aside." So she went from him and she shut the door behind herself and her sons. And as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There's not another." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." So the story, it's such a good example of, I think, just the way our relationship with God and the way that we can lead other people is because, yes, she went out and got the jars, and the amount of jars that were going to be filled was totally dependent on the amount of jars that she got. But the miracle was never on her. Like, it's a total miracle. God did a miracle, but he didn't go, like around her to do it. And in some ways, it's like, okay, we understand there's no limit in God at all. God can do any sort of miracle he wants. He created the world out of nothing. But the limiting factor in this story certainly seems to be the jars, that like God was going to do the miracle, but like it was going to be a 20 jar miracle or a 100 jar miracle or 1,000 jar miracle. God was going to use her faith and the proportion of her faith to end up working in this situation. So one way to say it would be that the blessing is in proportion to the jars. And I just think we got to kind of slow down and really, really, really get that concept in our heart and in our minds that, you kind of said it at the beginning, like, man, we can't multiply the oil. Like, that's God's part. But we can actually prepare the jars, and we can choose how many jars we're going to go out and get. And yeah, I can just imagine people saying, yeah, but how do I know if God's going to work, or how do I know if God's going to do that miracle? Well, I would just say, well, neither did she.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like we look at the story and it's like, okay, we see the whole story. But as the story was being like, as she was participating in it, well, she didn't know what was going to happen.
Right.
It's like Jesus and the fish and the loaves, or Peter going out and stepping on the water. Like, to be in the story is like, I don't know how it's going to end up, but God, wants us to prepare the jars.
Right.
How have you seen this?
Yeah. I mean,
play
there's
out?
no growth. There's no faith without risk, and it's like, if God didn't multiply the oil, it's like, you could see her neighbors saying, what did you think was about to happen here? Well, I kind of thought this was going to magically it would have been a big risk. I mean, she took a big risk is the point. And I think exactly what you're saying is right. Like, we don't control the multiplication of the oil. We have some hand in what we're preparing or what we're asking God to do. And that's what I was mentioning earlier is like, I think this can come out in a lot of different ways, but for me, the way that it comes out is when you ask the question to a pastor, like, man, what are you trying to see God do in your church? Because, the faith, to see that the faith and the jars and all that, it can be a little bit ambiguous as how it translates over until you ask the question, like, what are you asking God to do? And what are you preparing because you believe God can do something, Now, whether he does it or not, that's on him. But you can prepare and be ready. I mean, one of the things I think, if you just translate this straight over, Bob, we've seen this 100 times, 1,000 times, is like, when we think about a ministry thing, generally speaking, whatever we were ready for is about what God does. It's very much like this story. I think about this with our Christmas services just going on, just this past Christmas. It's like, man, we ended up having over 7,000 people attend. There were churches that probably had 70,000. There were churches that had 700. There were churches that had 70. We had 7,000. Now, well, what did we tell the church? We said, hey, for us to see 7,000, or we were going for 6. For us to see 6,000 people attend Christmas, we're going to need to see, I can't remember what the numbers was, 700 volunteers, whatever it was. And I just went back historically and was like, man, when we have this many volunteers, that's because that's what we're prepared to handle. Well, we went over our volunteer number by 80, and what did God do? It's like he brought another. I think that's very in line with what you're talking about here. I want to kick it back to you because I want to ask the question. The problem is when we have such a limited mindset on the front end, we never even ask God for the big or prepare for what he would do. I mean, to me, the biggest limiting belief, I know we're going to get into some of this for the next episode, is like, to me, one of the biggest limiting beliefs around all of this is I actually feel like I'm not supposed to prepare the jars or ask God to do anything big, because the anti-church growth movement has kind of gotten so into me or pressed down on me that I feel greedy, corporate. I feel like it's all about me. It's not honoring to God, whatever. You can pick your... And so it makes me not even want to voice something out loud or prepare the jars. I mean, that's got to be one of the biggest limiting beliefs.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people, like, I don't exactly know how this transition happens for leaders, because I think we all get the concept, and this is why I started with this, from the sense of salvation. Like, we understand you got to take a risk on God, right? I mean, you got to step out in faith. I mean, look at Hebrews 11. That's what it's all about. People that are put forth as like models for faith, like they had to step out before they could actually see the miracle. And we understand that in salvation, but for some reason, for church leaders at some point in kind of the church leadership journey, I think for a lot of people, a shift happens. And it may be like well into them leading where that shift happens, because I think there's probably a lot of milestones for a lot of people along the way, like for some church leaders, like when you feel called to ministry, you feel like you want to step into ministry, you were following that framework of, man, faith is going to have to precede God working. I don't know how this is going to work. I don't know if I can preach. I don't know if I can lead, but I'm willing to step out and do it. And same thing with starting a church. I mean, all the people around the world that have started brand new churches, like that takes a lot of faith to just step out and trust that God's going to do it on the back end. But at some point in the journey, that shifts to being more risk averse, where, we're afraid to say what it is that we're praying or hoping that God will do, or even worse, kind of what you're inferring, we stop believing God for like those really big things. And
and that's evidenced by not willing to ask, not willing to pray, not willing to say it out loud,
Yeah, it's like, it's almost like this psychological barrier where, you're kind of scared to ask or whatever, but you, at some point it moves to just where like, you're just not even like thinking like that anymore, And I mean, it's sad. And I've been around leaders like this, and I mean, we've all been there at some point in time, but you can get around leaders that are just kind of knocked down and they've stopped believing, like they believe the stories in the Bible and they believe Acts and they believe people are getting baptized and the church is growing and their life is changing, but they just don't believe it can happen through them. And they don't believe it can happen through their church. And so this is why I say a lot of times, maybe this is something we could talk about for a second. I mean, sometimes in like leadership circles, especially for newer leaders, we think, man, a lot of leadership is it's the tactics, right? It's like, man, I got to go learn some new tactics. I got to go learn how to do this. I got to go learn how to do this. And that's part of it. But I think as you grow as a leader, I would say 80% of it's more psychological.
Mindset.
Yeah. Faith, belief, mindset, fear, psychological, like everything that's going on inside ends up being the thing that can limit us versus something on the outside. Now, obviously, there's just a huge spiritual component to that, as we see from the story, and as church leaders, like, but I even believe there's even sort of a non-spiritual component. I don't know exactly how it works in the world, but like I'm around entrepreneurs and I hear stories all the time of, when people believe for something or their mindset shifts, that all of a sudden, they see different results, I was talking to a guy today. He shared the story. I think it's just fascinating from just a non kind of Christian perspective, but it's just fascinating to think about mindset and the way we limit ourselves. They talked about buying a like Midas car repair franchise, and they own like 30 of them. And they said they bought this one that had the same leadership team for years and years and years and years. And for the previous 8 years, the store did about $1 million a year in revenue. And then all of a sudden they bought it. The next year, nothing changed about the leadership team. Every single person on the leadership team was still there, and the store did $2 million. And they were so taken back by it, they went and asked the guy that was leading the store, like, what happened? And he just said, well, like, getting around you guys, and you're running all these different franchises, and you just kind of made us believe that we could do more. And that ended up trickling down into his team. And before you know it, they just doubled the sales like that. So that's why I say like so much of leadership is psychological. Now, obviously, as pastors, we understand the spiritual side of that.
Yeah, man, I totally agree. I mean, I think that you see it two ways primarily. I think, and you mentioned the one, you get beat down. You went for it. You put a big goal out there. You know, and it didn't happen, and you don't want to do that again. You got your hand burned. That leads to stop believing. That leads to some of the negative things you're mentioning. I think the other way you see this, though, in terms of a limited mindset, is where it's cloaked in piety, not asking God for this kind of stuff, not
almost like humility.
Oh yeah, I mean, we set a goal. We set a goal to see 5,000 baptisms by 2032, and the first few times I ever shared that out loud, there were people in the room that were like, "How dare you?" You know, and that's fine. You got to learn, you know, that's part of this podcast, I hope, is where people just go like, whatever, you know, like, man, if that's what you think about it, like, whatever, I don't really care. But you know, that's the thing. Like in that scenario, not having a goal, not voicing something big, not taking the step, not believing God for the big, not preparing the jars in a crazy way was seen as faithful. Rather than what we're saying is it's kind of the opposite of that. Now, one thing I think we could do, you know, so yeah, mindset, faith, however you want to say it, it's incredibly powerful. I think it is possible that there's people listening to this that maybe are like, well, you know, you guys have seen the church grow and all that. But dude, we've had a lot of times where we put stuff out there that didn't happen, you know, and I don't know if you can think of one. I mean, I've got one in my mind now that's more just attendance related, but I remember our first birthday. I don't know if you remember this. Like I had this big goal, prayer goal, getting leaders to pray, blah, blah, that we were going to see 400 people on our first birthday, you know, first year going into our second year. And we failed spectacularly. I mean, it was fall, it was right after Labor Day, and we were 2 services and all this and just total failed. And it's like, well, whatever God decided to do in that moment, I don't know why that should inform what I do in the next moment, right? Like if it's right, believe God for big things, big, hairy, audacious goals, thinking about preparing jars, what he could do, voicing that. Like, yeah, we took it on the chin a little bit for that one, but it's like, well, what do we do the next time, you know? Are we just going to kind of shrink back and all of a sudden do things that if God didn't move, we would hit the goal anyway? Or are we going to continue to push forward?
Yeah, let me share an example on the other side so that people can just get their mind around what it looks like, not just like individually, but as church leaders, what this can look like. And then we'll wrap this episode up. And we want to, in another episode, maybe just get into like some of the very specific actual limited beliefs that church leaders have, like things we actually say to ourselves inside our minds that end up sort of holding us back. But one example to me is a really key example that we've experienced is probably 3 years into Mercy Hill. So, you know, when we started, there was 30 people. We moved here. You know, the church grew pretty quick. When we got into like kind of a permanent Sunday situation, the church grew really quick. Basically grew 30 to 1,000 in, I don't know, what you say, 18 months or something like that. And we were in a situation where, I mean, we were seeing amazing things. I mean, all these college students coming and getting baptized and life changing, just the hand of God moving, the Holy Spirit moving. And we had to make a decision in that moment. Hey, we need more space because God is doing something amazing here. And in the somewhat junky business complex that our space was in, just kind of
it's lipstick on a pig. We've put
office complex. I mean, it's not even, I would say retail. It's not even retail. It's just office, C-grade office complex from the 80s. There was a space right next to us, and we're like, okay, we saw a way forward. Okay, we need to go upfit that space, and then our current space we are meeting in, that'll become our kids' space, and we'll just have a larger space altogether.
Double the seating capacity.
Right. And here was the issue, though. We just didn't have the money to do it. And we were fine going out and casting the vision and trying to raise the money, but the timing of it all just wasn't going to work. Like for us, we felt like because of what God was doing, we needed to actually step out. And this is where faith many times precedes the work of God. We needed to step out and do multiple things: sign the lease, before we had money. Go convince a contractor to do the work before we had money. And then after those things started, then go out and actually try to raise the money. So you could just imagine, signing a building contract. And we gave them our word, like we're gonna pay for this thing. But most of the times, they're wanting to see, well, how much money do you have in the bank and cash flow and all of that. And God was just working it, and I honor those guys that they took a risk on us too. But we stepped out and did all the stuff. Announced we're moving, announced the construction, announced the campaign, all of that before the money came in, before God actually moved. And a lot of leaders in that situation would sit around and they would say, okay, if God wants this to happen, then he's going to send us a check in the mail right now.
That's right.
And man, that sounds so, you're going to get like, man, amen, brother, amen, you're so faithful. And sometimes maybe that's how it works. But there's other times when it's like, man, I think faith is stepping out and taking a huge risk on God that he's moving and he's going to continue to move, and you trust that and you trust the outcome for that. So I think that's a real tangible example of, how that can look in leadership. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great example, and I think that you're probably going to have two reactions to that example. First of all, it's our story. It literally happened. So there's that. But you're going to have two reactions. One reaction is, that wasn't wise. We should have waited. And the reality is success leaves clues, meaning a lot of churches that are in growing situations, they have stories like that. And a lot of churches that are not, don't. And so it's like, man, there's a reality to what we're talking about. I'm not talking about being reckless. I'm not talking about being dumb for the sake of being, but there is a reality to, I think, where your mindset is around what you're believing God to do will prompt action that others don't take. And that, I think, is a good thing to end on, because in our next episode, I think, or one of our episodes coming up, we're going to talk about some of the big limiters that make people not want to believe God for the big, prepare the jars, and take a step. And as a result, they don't see. They don't see what some of the what God has for them out there. So, hey, this has been great, guys. If you have a chance, subscribe to our Breaking Barriers podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome.